The morning light crept through the streaked windows of Webb's Bread and Pastry at 5:15. Arthur Webb had been up since 4, as he had been for the last 42 years. The ritual never changed. Unlock the back door, flick on the fluorescent lights that hummed with ancient fatigue, and fire up the ovens that had cost him his savings to replace a decade ago, but still bore the scars of 1,000 burns. The scent of yeast and warm flour filled the space before he even touched the dough, a familiar ghost that haunted him in the best possible way. He was 72 now. His knees ached when the weather turned, and his fingers had knotted into the shape of loaves he'd shaped 1,000,000 times. But the bakery was his kingdom, a modest fiefdom on a corner lot that had seen better decades. The sign above the door was chipped, the paint faded to a whisper of gold, and the awning sagged just a little in the middle. He could have fixed it. He could have replaced the whole thing. But he never did. It was easier to let things stay the way they were, unremarkable and safe. Arthur had 3 children. Greg, the eldest, was a partner at a firm in Chicago that handled mergers and acquisitions for people who had more money than sense. Jennifer, the middle, ran a surgical practice in Seattle that made her a minor celebrity in medical journals. Evan, the youngest, had founded a tech startup that had been bought for an obscene sum, and he now lived in a glass house overlooking the bay, sipping wine with people whose names Arthur had to look up on the internet to recognize. They were all successful, all brilliant, all so busy that they couldn't make it to their mother's funeral 5 years ago until the service was already over. They had flown in on red-eyes, stood in the rain, shaken hands with strangers who knew Helen better than they did, and flown out within the hour. Greg had patted Arthur on the shoulder and said, "You'll be fine, Dad. You're tough." Jennifer had handed him a sleek envelope with a gift card to a steakhouse he'd never visit. Evan had promised to call, and he had, twice, in the following 6 months, both times when he was between meetings and needed to talk about his stock options. Arthur didn't complain. He had never complained, not when Greg told him his bakery was quaint, but you should really think about retiring. Not when Jennifer suggested he sell the building and move into assisted living. Not when Evan laughed and said, "You still live above the shop, Dad? That's so you." He had given them everything. When Greg needed a down payment for his first house, Arthur had pulled money from his retirement account, pretending it was no trouble. When Jennifer's medical school loans came due, he had co-signed for a second mortgage on the building. When Evan wanted to start his company but couldn't get a bank to take him seriously, Arthur had written a check that drained half his savings. He had done it all without a word, with the quiet smile of a man who believed that his children were his legacy, that their success was his success, that one day, when they had made their marks on the world, they would remember the baker who had kneaded his way to their futures. That day never came. They still called, but the calls got shorter. They asked about the bakery, but their voices had that faint, polite edge of someone waiting for the conversation to end. They sent birthday cards, but the handwriting was always some assistance, and the messages were generic. They sent gifts that were clearly picked from a catalog. Cashmere scarves he never wore, expensive coffee he didn't like, books on retirement planning that sat unopened in a stack by his chair. And then there was the matter of the building. Greg had started it 3 years ago. He had come to visit, a rare occurrence, with his wife, Margaret, a sharp woman with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. They had sat at Arthur's table, the one with the scratched surface and the wobbly leg that he kept meaning to fix, and Margaret had said, "Arthur, this neighborhood is changing. You know that. The property values are going up. You're sitting on a gold mine." Arthur had smiled. "It's not a mine. It's a bakery." "But the building," Greg had pressed. "You own the building free and clear. You could sell it for 3 times what you paid. Maybe more. You could put that money into a trust, live comfortably. Stop killing yourself over dough." "I like dough," Arthur had said, and he had meant it. Margaret's smile had tightened. "We're just thinking about your future, Arthur. And ours, if we're being honest. The kids' college funds, the mortgage on the new house. It's not that we need the money, but it would be nice to have a buffer." Arthur had nodded. He had understood, in that moment, that his children saw the bakery not as his life's work, but as a check waiting to be cashed. They had seen the broken awning and the faded sign and decided that he was a burden, an old man clinging to a past that no longer mattered. They had looked at his flour-dusted hands and seen only inefficiency. He had told them no, quietly, gently, with the same soft voice he used when a customer complained about the crust on his sourdough. He had said, "This bakery is mine. It will stay mine until I can't work anymore. And even then, I'll figure something out." Greg had been angry. Jennifer had been disappointed. Evan had sent a long email that Arthur had barely read, something about fiduciary responsibility and estate planning. They had all retreated to their lives, and the calls had gotten shorter, the gift cards more generic. Arthur had felt the distance grow like a crack in the pavement, widening with every silence. But he had kept baking. He had kept opening the doors at 6 in the morning, kept greeting Mrs. Harlow and Mr. Finch and the young officer who always asked for a Danish. He had kept his routines, his rituals, his quiet, stubborn refusal to let his children's resentment sour the one thing that had never betrayed him. Then the little girl came. He first saw her on a Tuesday. She was sitting on the curb across the street, her back against the lamppost, her legs pulled so tightly to her chest that she looked like a folded piece of laundry. She was tiny, maybe 12 or 13, with hair that was more matte than strands and a face so thin that her cheekbones looked sharp enough to cut glass. Her clothes were the kind that came from donation bins and discount racks, washed too many times, worn too thin. Arthur had watched her for an hour before he acted. He had seen her watching the bakery, her eyes tracking the customers who came and went, the steam that rose from the coffee cups, the plates of pastries that vanished into hands and mouths. She never moved, never asked for anything. She just sat there, waiting for something he couldn't name. On the third day, he walked out with a glass of milk and a slice of the coffee cake he'd made that morning. He held it out to her with both hands, the way he used to hold out treats to his own children when they were small and the world was still soft. She had stared at him for a long time, her eyes narrowed, her body coiled like an animal ready to run. "It's just milk," he had said. "And cake. No tricks." She had taken it. She had eaten it in rapid, desperate bites, the way someone who's forgotten what food tastes like consumes it. He had watched her, his chest tight, and said, "Same time tomorrow." She came back. Every day. He never asked her name, and she never offered it. He just gave her milk and a pastry, and she ate it like it was a sacrament. He learned to recognize the sound of her footsteps, the way she moved like a shadow, the way she never made eye contact. He started setting aside the best cakes for her, the ones with the thickest frosting, the ones he'd normally save for special orders. It was the only thing that made him feel like himself. Not the father of Greg and Jennifer and Evan, not the target of their quiet, persistent demands, not the old man they were waiting to bury. Just Arthur, the baker who gave milk and cake to a girl who had nothing. Then the fourth child came. It was a Saturday, 3 weeks after the girl had started appearing. Arthur was in the back, shaping baguettes, when his daughter walked through the door. Jennifer looked exactly the same as she had in the photo she'd sent for Christmas. Expensive haircut, tailored coat, the kind of posture that came from years of commanding operating rooms. She was alone, which surprised him. She usually traveled with her husband, Martin, a surgeon with a handshake that crushed fingers and eyes that never stopped calculating. "Dad?" she said, and the word was warm but careful, like she was testing a wound. Arthur wiped his hands on his apron. "Jennifer, this is a surprise. I had a conference in the city. I thought I'd stop by." She looked around the bakery, her gaze sliding over the counter, the display case, the tables that had been there since the 80s. Her smile was polite but tight. "It looks the same. That's the idea." She sat at the table by the window, the one where the girl usually ate. Arthur poured her coffee, black, no sugar, exactly as she'd always liked it. He set it down in front of her and waited. "Dad?" she began again, and he knew the tone. It was the same tone she used when she had to deliver bad news to a patient's family. "I'm worried about you." "I'm fine." "You're not. You're 72. You're working 12-hour days. You're living above a bakery that hasn't been updated since the Reagan administration." She leaned forward. "You need to think about the future, about what happens when you can't do this anymore." "I'm not planning to stop. That's the problem." Her voice sharpened. "You're not planning at all. You're just existing. And that's okay, if that's what you want. But it's not just about you, Dad. It's about us. About the family. Greg is stressed. Evan is about to go through a divorce. I have 2 kids who need to go to college. We need to know that you're taken care of. That we're taken care of." Arthur set down the baguette he had been shaping. "What are you asking me, Jennifer?" "I'm asking you to sell the building." She said it flatly, with the clinical detachment of a doctor delivering a diagnosis. The market is hot. You can get top dollar. You can put the money into a trust, live off the interest, and still have enough to help your grandchildren. It's the smart move. And where would I bake? She blinked. You don't need to bake, Dad. You need to retire. I don't want to retire. That's not practical. Her voice was rising now, the voice she used when she was losing a debate. You're being stubborn. You're clinging to this place like it's a lifeline when it's just a building. Don't you understand that? It's just a building, and it's holding you back. It's holding us back. Arthur looked at her. He saw his wife's face in hers, the same sharp chin, the same stubborn set to her jaw. But Helen had never looked at him like that, like he was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed. I'll think about it, he said, because he had learned that it was easier to say than no, easier to let the words hang in the air and dissolve. That Jennifer smiled, satisfied. Good. That's all I'm asking. Just think about it. She left an hour later. She didn't stay for lunch. She didn't ask how he was, didn't ask about the bakery, didn't ask about the small, thin girl who appeared at the same time every morning. She kissed his cheek, the dry, absent kiss of someone who had already moved on to the next thing, and walked out the door. Arthur stood in the middle of the bakery, surrounded by the scent of bread and the hum of the old refrigerator, and felt something crack. He had always believed that his children loved him, even if they didn't show it. He had always believed that their distance was about their own busy lives, not about him. But Jennifer's visit had peeled back the last layer of that lie. She wasn't worried about him. She was worried about his money, his building, his capacity to be useful to them. He thought about Greg, who had called last week to talk about the market, and then casually mentioned that he needed to refinance his house, and would Arthur consider cashing out a bond that Helen had left him. He thought about Evan, whose email had been full of jargon, but whose meaning was unmistakable. Dad, you have assets. We need them. Don't be selfish. He had never said no to any of them. Not once. He had given and given until his accounts were thinner than he was comfortable admitting, and they had taken and taken without ever asking if he needed anything in return. They had treated him like a resource, like a well that would never run dry. The girl came that afternoon, later than usual. She looked tired, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands shaking as she reached for the milk he offered. He sat with her while she ate, not speaking, just watching her devour the pastry like it was her last meal. You okay? He asked. She shrugged. I had a bad night. It's fine. You can stay here, he said. If you need. I have a couch upstairs. She looked at him with those hollow eyes, and for a moment, he thought she might cry. But she didn't. She just nodded and went back to eating. He didn't know why he offered. Maybe it was because he felt like he was drowning, and helping her was the only thing that made him feel like he was breathing. Maybe it was because he saw himself in her, the way she folded herself small, the way she expected nothing. Maybe it was because he was tired of being the baker who gave and got nothing but demands in return. Thank you, she said. For the cake. For the milk. For all of it. You don't have to thank me, he said. You're welcome here. Every day. As long as you need. She smiled, a thin, fragile smile that barely touched her lips. And Arthur felt something shift in his chest. A decision, maybe. A promise. That night, after the bakery closed and the girl was asleep on the couch in his apartment, Arthur sat at his kitchen table and opened the old trunk in the corner of his bedroom. It was full of papers, bank statements, tax returns, deeds, and one thick envelope he had never opened. It had been sent to him 30 years ago, after his mother died, and he had tucked it away without reading it. He had been too angry then, too determined to build his own life, to accept anything from the man who had thrown him out. He opened it now. The letter inside was written in his mother's hand, her elegant script looping across the page. The trust document was yellowed and fragile. The numbers were written in a formal, legal font. He read them once, twice, 3 times, his hands trembling. $3 billion. In trust, accruing interest. His mother had left him everything. His father had lied, had told him he was disinherited, had made him believe he had nothing. And Arthur, too proud and too hurt, had never questioned it. He had walked away and built his life from scratch, never once imagining that the fortune was waiting for him. He looked at the letter. He read the words again, his heart pounding. And then he looked at the door to his apartment, where the girl lay sleeping, and thought about the children who had never asked him how he was, who had never thanked him for the years of sacrifice, who had made it clear that he was useful only as long as he was giving. He wasn't going to tell them. Not yet. He was going to wait. He was going to watch. He was going to let them keep asking, keep demanding, keep underestimating him. And when they had shown him exactly who they were, when they had revealed every shred of their greed and their contempt, he was going to show them the truth. He folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. He placed the envelope in the drawer of his desk, next to the key to the bakery. The girl woke at dawn. She padded into the kitchen, still half asleep, and sat at the table. Arthur poured her milk, cut her a slice of the cake he'd made the night before, and sat across from her. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah." She said, "Sarah." He nodded. "I'm Arthur." "I know," she said. "Everyone knows you. You're the baker." He smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. "I'm not just the baker," he said. "I'm something else too. I just don't know what yet." She didn't understand. That was fine. He didn't need her to understand. He just needed her to stay. He needed someone in his life who wasn't looking for his money, his building, his approval. The day passed normally. Customers came and went. Mrs. Harlow bought her multigrain. Mr. Finch complained about the price of rye. The young officer grabbed his coffee and Danish dot, and then, at exactly 4 in the afternoon, the engine. Arthur was in the back, pulling a tray of baguettes from the oven. The sound of it was low and deep, a rumble that vibrated through the floor and rattled the glass in the display case. He set down the tray and walked to the front of the bakery. Through the window, he saw them. 15 black SUVs, parked in perfect formation along his street. Their windows were tinted so dark that he couldn't see inside. Their engines idled with a steady, threatening hum. Men in black suits spilled out. They moved with precision, surrounding the bakery like a cordon. They didn't speak. They didn't look at each other. They just stood there, waiting. Arthur's hands were steady. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steadied. At the door of the middle SUV opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, with silver hair and a face that looked carved from stone. He walked toward the bakery, his steps measured and deliberate. Arthur opened the door before the man could knock. "Mr. Webb," the man said, "my employer would like to see you. It's a matter of utmost urgency." Arthur looked at the line of SUVs. He looked at the men in their suits. He thought about the letter in his desk, the trust fund that had been waiting for him for 30 years. "Who's your employer?" he asked. The man smiled. It was a cold smile, a corporate smile, the kind of smile that meant trouble. "Someone who's been looking for you for a very long time, Mr. Webb. Someone who knows exactly who you are, and someone who's prepared to offer you a deal you can't refuse." Arthur stared at him. He felt the weight of the day, the weight of the years, the weight of every demand, every dismissal, every moment of silence from his children. He stepped out of the bakery, pulling the door closed behind him. "I'm listening," he said. The man gestured toward the SUVs. "My employer prefers to discuss these matters in person. Please, this way." Arthur looked at the bakery. He looked at the sign, the faded gold letters, the awning that sagged just a little in the middle. He looked at the men in their suits, at the impossible luxury of 15 black SUVs parked on his modest street. And then he walked toward the middle vehicle. He didn't know what was waiting for him. He didn't know if it was a threat or an offer or something else entirely. But he knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was going to change everything. And for the first time in 40 years, Arthur Webb was ready to stop giving and start taking. The interior of the SUV smelled like leather and money. Arthur settled into the seat, his flour-dusted jeans brushing against upholstery that probably cost more than his monthly rent. The man who had summoned him sat across from him, his silver hair immaculate, his suit a dark charcoal that seemed to absorb the light. He was older than Arthur had first thought, maybe 80, with deep lines around his eyes and the kind of weathered hands that had done real work once, a long time ago. "You don't know me," the man said, "but I knew your mother, Margaret Webb. She was a remarkable woman." Arthur felt the words land like stones in his chest. "You knew my mother. We were colleagues. Partners, in a sense." The man leaned forward, and his eyes were kind, which somehow made Arthur more wary. "She trusted me with the details of her estate. The trust she set up for you. I was the one who made sure it survived when your father tried to dissolve it." Arthur's mouth went dry. "You're the trustee." "I'm the trustee." The man extended his hand. "My name is Harold Finch. I've been holding your inheritance for 30 years, Mr. Webb, and I think it's time we talked about what comes next." The SUV pulled away from the curb. Arthur watched his bakery shrink in the side mirror, the faded gold sign growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared behind a row of identical black vehicles. He thought about Sarah, asleep on his couch. He thought about the dough he'd left rising in the kitchen, the baguettes that would overproof if he didn't get back soon. He thought about his children and the demands they'd made, and the way they'd looked at him like he was already gone. "I don't want the money," Arthur said. Harold Finch smiled. It was a gentle smile, the kind that came from decades of reading people. "Your mother said you'd say that. She told me you were stubborn, that you'd built your own life, and you'd refuse to accept help from anyone, even if it was rightfully yours. She knew me. She knew you very well." Finch reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder, thicker than the one Arthur's father had presented. "She also knew that you might change your mind. That's why she set up the trust the way she did. Not just for you, Mr. Webb. For your children. For their children. For generations." Arthur stared at the folder. His mother's handwriting was on the cover, the same elegant script he'd seen in the letter. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that the trust isn't just money. It's a structure, a legacy, and it's been waiting for you to take control of it for 3 decades. Finch opened the folder and spread documents across the seat between them. "The principal has grown substantially, but there are conditions, requirements. Your mother was a clever woman, and she wanted to make sure that whoever inherited this fortune would use it wisely." "What kind of conditions?" Finch tapped the document with his forefinger. "The trust is structured to release funds in phases. The first phase is triggered by your acceptance of the trusteeship. The second phase requires you to demonstrate that you are actively managing the assets. And the third phase, the full disbursement, requires something else entirely." Arthur waited. The SUV glided through the city streets, past buildings he'd known his whole life, past the corner where he'd first seen Sarah sitting against the lamppost. "The third phase requires you to identify a successor," Finch said. "Someone you trust to carry on the legacy. Someone who shares your values. Someone who understands that wealth is a tool, not a prize." Arthur thought about Greg, who had never worked a day with his hands. He thought about Jennifer, who saw everything in terms of utility and cost. He thought about Evan, who had once told Arthur that old money is just dead money, Dad. It needs to be deployed. "None of my children," Arthur said quietly. "They don't understand. They've never understood." Finch nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "Then you'll need to choose someone else. Someone worthy." The SUV stopped at a traffic light. Arthur looked out the window and saw a young woman pushing a cart full of recyclables, her face thin and tired. He thought of Sarah's hollow eyes, the way she'd eaten the cake like she'd never tasted anything so sweet. "I know someone," Arthur said. "But she's young. She doesn't know anything about money." "The trust can teach her," Finch said. "It's designed to mentor, not just to give. But first, you have to accept the trusteeship. You have to take the reins." Arthur was silent for a long moment. He looked at the documents, at his mother's handwriting, at the numbers that represented more wealth than he'd ever imagined. He thought about the bakery, the one thing he'd built with his own hands. He thought about Sarah, sleeping on his couch. He thought about his children, who had never asked if he was happy. "What happens if I don't accept?" he asked. That Finch's smile didn't waver. "Then the trust remains in limbo. The assets continue to grow, but no one benefits. The money just sits there, waiting for someone to claim it. Eventually, the courts will intervene, and the government will take a significant portion. Your mother's legacy will be scattered to the wind." Arthur closed his eyes. He saw his mother's face, the way she'd looked at him when he was young and defiant, when he'd told her he was leaving to make his own way. She hadn't tried to stop him. She'd just hugged him and whispered, "You'll come back. You'll understand one day." He opened his eyes. "I'll accept, but on one condition." Finch raised an eyebrow. "Name it. Give me time. Time to prepare. Time to make sure that when I take control, I do it the right way. I don't want to rush into this." Arthur's voice was steady, the same voice he used when he was shaping dough, when he was waiting for it to rise. "There are things I need to do first. People I need to understand." Finch studied him for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "You have 6 months. After that, the trust will begin the disbursement process whether you're ready or not. Use the time wisely." The SUV pulled over to the curb. Arthur looked out the window and saw his bakery, small and unassuming, its lights still on. He could see Sarah through the glass, sitting at the table by the window, waiting. One more thing, Finch said as Arthur reached for the door handle. Your father, Thomas Webb III. He's not the enemy you think he is. He's a broken man, Mr. Webb. He made terrible choices, but he's been living with the consequences for 30 years. When you're ready, you might want to hear what he has to say. Arthur stepped out of the SUV without responding. He walked toward his bakery, his hands in his pockets, his mind churning with the weight of everything he'd just learned. The SUVs pulled away in perfect formation, disappearing into the twilight like they'd never been there at all. Sarah was waiting at the table. She'd made herself tea from the kettle in the back, and she'd arranged the pastries in the display case, straightening the rows like she'd been doing it for years. She looked up when he walked in, her hollow eyes searching his face. You okay? She asked. You look like you saw a ghost. Arthur sat down across from her. Something like that. He poured himself a cup of coffee, black, no sugar, and took a long sip. The warmth spread through his chest, grounding him to, I met someone today, he said. Someone who knew my mother. Someone who told me things I didn't know about myself. Sarah didn't ask what things. She just nodded, her silence offering him the space to speak or to stay quiet. Arthur set down his cup. Sarah, I have a question, and I need you to answer honestly. Okay, if you had a chance to do something big, something that would change your life completely, something that would give you everything you never had, would you take it? She stared at him, her hands wrapped around her teacup. I don't know. I've never had a chance like that. I've never had a choice about anything. Arthur nodded. I understand that. And I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm just asking you to think about it. He leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. Because something is coming. Something big. And I'm going to need someone I can trust. Someone who understands what it means to have nothing and who won't forget it when they have everything. Sarah's eyes widened. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the future, Arthur said. My future. And maybe yours too, if you want it. The bell above the door chimed. Arthur looked up and saw Greg standing in the doorway, his face pale, his suit rumpled like he'd flown in from Chicago and come straight to the bakery. Dad, Greg said. We need to talk. Now. Arthur didn't stand. He didn't invite his son to sit. He just looked at him, his face calm, his voice measured. What's so urgent that you had to fly across the country without calling first? Greg stepped inside, his eyes darting around the bakery. He looked at Sarah, his gaze flicking over her like she was furniture. I heard something. A rumor. About a trust. About grandmother's estate. He swallowed hard. Is it true? Dad, is there money? Arthur leaned back in his chair. He looked at his son, at the sweat on his brow, at the desperation in his eyes. He thought about all the years he'd given, all the checks he'd written, all the sacrifices he'd made for this man who stood before him, asking not how he was, not if he needed anything, but if there was money. There's a trust, Arthur said quietly. And yes, there's money. A lot of it. But it's not yours, Greg. It's never been yours. Greg's face went white. What are you talking about? I'm your son. I'm your heir. That money belongs to the family. It belongs to me, Arthur said. And I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do with it. Greg took a step forward, his hands shaking. Dad, you can't be serious. You can't just... I have a mortgage. I have kids. I have a bakery, Arthur said. I have a girl who sleeps on my couch because she has nowhere else to go. I have a life I built with my own hands, without a penny from anyone. And I've spent 40 years giving everything I had to children who never once asked if I was happy. His voice was rising now, the calm cracking into something raw and real. I'm tired, Greg. I'm tired of being the old man who hands out money and gets nothing back but demands. I'm tired of being invisible. Greg stared at him. You're not invisible. I'm here, aren't I? You're here because you heard about the money, Arthur said. That's the only reason. If there was no trust, you wouldn't be standing in my bakery. You'd be in Chicago, with your wife and your mortgage and your busy life. And you wouldn't think about me until the next holiday card. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Greg's face cycled through emotions, shock, anger, disbelief, and then a cold, calculating stillness that Arthur recognized from 100 family dinners. You're making a mistake, Greg said softly. You're throwing away your family. For what? For her? He gestured at Sarah, his lip curling. Some street kid you picked up off the curb. She's not your daughter, Dad. She's a stranger. She's using you. Sarah didn't flinch. She looked at Greg with those hollow eyes, and something in her gaze was steady, unshakable. "I've never used anyone," she said. "I don't know how." "Shut up," Greg snapped. "This doesn't involve you. It involves everyone I choose to involve," Arthur said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of an avalanche. "And right now, Greg, I'm choosing to involve her. If you don't like it, you can leave. The door's right there." Greg's face went red. He opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The bell jangled wildly, then fell silent. Arthur exhaled slowly. He looked at Sarah, who was still holding her teacup, her knuckles white. "Are you okay?" he asked. She nodded, but her hands were shaking. "He's your son. He's my son," Arthur said. "And he's going to make this very difficult. He's going to call his brother and sister. They're going to come here, and they're going to try to convince me that I'm wrong, that I owe them, that the money should be theirs." "Are they right?" Arthur smiled. It was a tired smile, the smile of a man who'd been fighting for too long. "No, they're not right, but they're going to make me feel like they are." He set down his cup and looked at her, really looked at her. "That's why I need you, Sarah. Not because I want to use you. Because I need someone who sees me the way I really am, not the way they think I am." Sarah met his gaze. "I see you," she said. "You're the man who gives milk and cake to a girl he doesn't know. You're the man who locks the door at night and sleeps above a bakery. You're the man who doesn't complain, even when everyone takes from him. That's who I see." Arthur felt something loosen in his chest, like a knot he'd been carrying for years finally starting to unravel. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For seeing me." The next morning, Arthur woke to find 3 voicemails on his phone. One from Jennifer, her voice clipped and cold. One from Evan, his words calm but laced with threat. One from Greg, a slurred, angry rant that ended with the words, "You'll regret this, Dad. You'll regret everything." Arthur listened to them in the darkness of his apartment, the phone pressed to his ear, the city waking up outside his window. Then he deleted them all. He went downstairs to the bakery. He fired up the ovens, mixed the dough, and shaped the bread. He set out the milk and the pastries for Sarah. When she came down, her hair brushed, her face clean, she looked almost like a different person. Almost like someone who had a future. "Today," Arthur said, "we're going to do something different." "What?" "We're going to make a plan. We're going to figure out exactly what we need to do, and we're going to do it carefully, step by step." He looked at her. "Are you ready for that?" Sarah nodded. "I'm ready." Arthur opened the drawer of his desk and pulled out the envelope with his mother's letter. He set it on the counter between them. "The first step," he said, "is learning the truth. All of it. About the trust, about my family, about everything. And the second step," he paused, his hand resting on the envelope. "The second step is deciding who I'm going to become, and who I'm going to take with me." Sarah reached out and touched the envelope, her fingers brushing against the yellowed paper. "Who are you going to become?" Arthur smiled. It was a slow smile, the kind that came from years of waiting, years of patience, years of letting things rise in their own time. "I'm going to become someone they can't ignore," he said. "Someone they can't manipulate. Someone they can't control." He looked at her, his eyes bright with the first flicker of purpose he'd felt in decades. "And when I do, they're going to understand exactly what they lost." The sun rose over the city, casting long shadows through the bakery windows. The dough was rising. The ovens were hot. And Arthur Webb, the quiet baker who had given everything to everyone, was finally ready to take back what was his. The week that followed was unlike any Arthur had experienced in his 42 years of baking. The rhythm of his life had always been predictable: flour, water, yeast, heat, repeat. But now, the silence between the chimes of the doorbell felt charged, like the air before a summer storm. That Sarah had become a permanent fixture. She slept on the couch in his apartment, her thin frame curled beneath a blanket he'd pulled from the back of his closet. She helped him in the mornings, setting out the pastries, wiping down the counters, learning the names of the regulars. Mrs. Harlow had asked if she was his granddaughter, and Arthur had said something like that. The young officer had smiled and given her an extra Danish. Mr. Finch had grumbled that she'd arranged the rye bread wrong, but his eyes had softened when she'd fixed it without complaint. She was quiet, but she was present. And that, Arthur realized, was more than he'd had from his own children in years. The calls continued. Jennifer left voicemails that grew increasingly sharp, her surgical precision turned into verbal scalpel. "Dad, I've spoken to a lawyer. If you're being manipulated, there are legal remedies. You don't have to do this alone. Evan sent emails filled with financial jargon, carefully worded threats about fiduciary obligations and family responsibility. Greg called at odd hours, sometimes drunk, sometimes coldly sober, his voice veering between pleading and anger. Arthur listened to them all. He read the emails. He saved the voicemails in a folder on his phone, a digital record of their desperation. And he said nothing. He was waiting that Harold Finch had given him 6 months. But Arthur knew, with the instinct of a man who'd spent a lifetime reading the rise and fall of Doe, that he had far less time than that. His children were circling, their greed sharpening into something dangerous. They would not wait for him to make a decision. They would try to force one. On the 8th day after Greg's visit, Jennifer showed up at the bakery in person. She arrived at noon, just as the lunch rush was dying down, her heels clicking against the worn linoleum. She was dressed for battle, tailored blazer, pearl earrings, a leather briefcase that probably cost as much as Arthur's oven. Martin was with her, his handshake as crushing as ever, his smile polished and cold. "Dad," Jennifer said, and the word was an accusation. "We need to talk." Privately, Arthur glanced at Sarah, who was stacking cups behind the counter. Her hands were steady, but her eyes were watchful. "You can talk in front of her," he said. "She's part of this now." Jennifer's jaw tightened. "She's a child, a stranger. This is family business." "Sarah is more family to me than you've been in the last 5 years," Arthur said. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "So either you talk in front of her, or you don't talk at all." Jennifer exchanged a look with Martin. He gave an almost imperceptible nod, and she turned back to Arthur, her expression hardening. "Fine, we'll talk in front of her." She pulled out a chair and sat down, her posture rigid. Martin remained standing, his arms crossed, his presence a silent intimidation. Arthur sat across from them. He didn't offer coffee. He didn't offer pastries. He just waited to the trust, Jennifer began. "Greg told us about it. He said you met with someone. A lawyer. A trustee." She leaned forward. "Dad, this is serious. That trust was set up by grandmother, and it's been mismanaged for decades. We have reason to believe that the current trustee is not acting in the best interests of the beneficiaries." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "And who are the beneficiaries?" "You," Jennifer said. "And your descendants. That's us. Greg, Evan, and me. The family." She spread her hands. "We've been cut out of this for too long. We need to know what's in that trust. We need to have a say in how it's managed." Arthur leaned back in his chair. He looked at his daughter, at the pearls around her neck, at the briefcase on the table. He thought about the years he'd spent paying her tuition, co-signing her loans, giving her everything she'd asked for. He thought about the way she'd looked at him at the funeral, her eyes dry, her mind already on her flight back to Seattle. "You want to say," Arthur repeated. "You want to manage the trust. We want to protect it," Martin interjected, his voice smooth and oily. "There are people out there who would take advantage of an elderly man. You're vulnerable, Arthur. You've been isolated. And now there's this girl." He gestured at Sarah with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "This girl who appeared out of nowhere, who's living in your apartment, who's obviously manipulating you for access to your assets." Sarah said nothing. She stood behind the counter, her hands gripping the edge, her face unreadable. "She doesn't need to manipulate me," Arthur said. "She doesn't want anything from me. She wants milk and cake. That's all she's ever asked for." Jennifer's eyes narrowed. "That's ridiculous. She's not here for milk and cake. She's here because she knows you're vulnerable. She knows you're lonely. She knows you've been cut off from your family, and she's exploiting that." "Cut off?" Arthur's voice was soft, but there was an edge to it that made Jennifer pause. "Who cut me off, Jennifer? Was it her, or was it you? Tell me. When was the last time you called just to ask how I was? When was the last time you visited without asking for something? When was the last time you looked at me and saw your father? Instead of a check waiting to be cashed," Jennifer's face flushed. "That's not fair. We've been busy. We have lives. We have responsibilities." "So do I," Arthur said. "And my responsibility right now is to make sure that this trust ends up in the right hands. Not your hands. Not Greg's. Not Evan's. The right hands." "Whose hands?" Martin demanded. "That girl, she's a street kid, Arthur. She has no education, no connections, no understanding of how the world works. You're going to hand $1 billion trust to a child who can't even spell fiduciary. She can learn. Arthur said. She's smart. She's resilient. She's survived things your children will never understand. And she's loyal. She's loyal without needing a reason. He looked at Jennifer. Can you say the same? Jennifer stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is insane. You're throwing away your legacy for some homeless girl you found on the street. Do you even hear yourself? I hear myself perfectly, Arthur said. And for the first time in years, I like what I'm hearing. Jennifer stared at him, her eyes blazing. Martin stepped forward, his hand on her shoulder, but she shook him off. Fine, she said. If that's how you want to play this, fine. But don't think we're going to just walk away. Greg is filing a petition in court. We're going to challenge the trust. We're going to prove that you're not competent to manage it, and we're going to take control. For your own good, Dad. For your own safety. She turned and walked toward the door. Martin followed, casting one last cold look at Arthur. The bell chimed as they left. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hum of the old refrigerator. Arthur sat at the table, his hands flat on the surface, his eyes fixed on the door. Are you okay? Sarah asked. She'd come around the counter and was standing beside him, her voice barely a whisper. I'm fine, Arthur said. I expected this. They're going to try to break me. They're going to try to prove I'm senile. They're going to bring lawyers and doctors and whoever else they can find to make me look like a fool. Can they do that? Arthur shrugged. They can try, and they might succeed if I let them. He looked up at her. But I'm not going to let them. I'm going to fight. I'm going to prepare. And when the time comes, I'm going to show them exactly who I am. He stood up and walked to the back of the bakery, where the old safe was tucked beneath the counter. He'd bought it decades ago, when the neighborhood was rougher, and he'd never used it for anything important. But now, he opened it and pulled out a stack of papers he'd been accumulating over the past week. Financial statements, property deeds, tax records. Everything Harold Finch had given him, plus everything he'd dug up on his own. He spread them across the counter. Sarah came over and stood beside him, looking at the papers with wide eyes. What is all this? She asked. This, Arthur said, is my life. The life I built. The assets I accumulated. The proof that I'm not just some old baker who got lucky. I've been careful. I've been smart. I've been building a foundation, even when I didn't know I was building one. He pointed to a row of numbers. This is my retirement account. It's not huge, but it's solid. This is the deed to the bakery. I own it free and clear. And this, he pointed to a stack of certificates. This is an investment account I started 30 years ago with a small inheritance from my mother. I never touched it. I let it grow, and it's grown a lot. Sarah's eyes moved from paper to paper. How much? Arthur smiled. Enough. Enough to give me options. Enough to make sure that if my children try to force my hand, I can push back. But they're talking about a court case, Sarah said. They're talking about proving you're incompetent. If they win, I lose control of the trust. They become the trustees. And they'll drain it dry, every last dollar, leaving nothing for anyone else. Arthur's voice was steady, but there was something dark beneath it. That's why I need to move fast. Before they can file their petition. Before they can get a judge to listen to them. He looked at her. I need to change the terms of the trust. I need to name a successor. And I need to do it in a way that my children can't challenge. Sarah's breath caught. You want to name me? I want you to help me, Arthur said. I want you to be the person I trust. The person who understands what it means to have nothing and who will never forget it. I'm not naming you because I feel sorry for you. I'm naming you because you're the only person who's ever seen me. She stared at him, her hollow eyes bright with unshed tears. I don't know anything about money. I don't know anything about trusts or courts or any of this. Neither did I, Arthur said. But I learned. And you can learn too. Harold Finch can teach you. He's a good man, and he'll help you understand what you're getting into. He put his hand on her shoulder. I'm not doing this because I want to burden you. I'm doing it because I believe in you. I believe you can do this. Sarah was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded, slowly at first, then with more conviction. Okay, I'll do it. I'll try. Arthur smiled. It was the first real smile he'd felt in years, a warmth that spread through his chest and eased the ache that had lived there so long. Good. That's my girl. He turned back to the papers, his mind already racing with plans. He would need to contact Harold Finch. He would need to have new documents drawn up. He would need to protect Sarah, to make sure that his children couldn't harm her or intimidate her. And he would need to do it all quietly, carefully, Without tipping his hand, the bakery was quiet. The ovens were cold. The pastries were gone, sold to the lunch crowd. Arthur looked around at the modest space, the worn floors, the faded sign, and he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in decades. This was his kingdom, his legacy, his proof that he'd done something right, even if his children had never appreciated it. Sarah was standing at the counter, reading one of the documents. She looked up, her brow furrowed. What if your children come back? What if they bring lawyers? What if they try to take this building? Arthur walked over to her and placed his hand on the counter. Let them come, he said. I've been underestimated my whole life. By my father, by my children, by everyone who looked at me and saw a baker instead of a man. But I'm done being underestimated. He met her eyes. When they come, I'll be ready. And when they leave, they'll understand exactly what they lost. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the bakery windows. Arthur watched the light fade, and he thought about the weeks ahead. The court filings, the family meetings, the war that was coming. But he wasn't afraid. For the first time in decades, he wasn't afraid. He had Sarah. He had his bakery. He had the trust, and he had a plan. And he had a secret weapon that his children didn't know about. Patience. Years and years of patience, learned from kneading dough and waiting for it to rise. He could wait. He could watch. And when the moment was right, he would strike. The doorbell chimed. Arthur looked up, expecting another confrontation. But it was Mrs. Harlow, her face flushed and worried. Arthur, she said. There's a woman outside. She's been sitting on the curb for an hour. She looks like she's in trouble. Arthur walked to the door. He opened it and looked down the street. It was his mother-in-law, Eleanor. He hadn't seen her in years, not since Helen's funeral. She was sitting on the curb, her hands in her lap, her face pale and drawn as she looked up at him, her eyes wet with tears. Arthur, she said, they told me about the trust. They told me you were giving it away. She stood up, her legs trembling. I came to stop you. I came to make you see reason. Arthur looked at her. He remembered the woman who had welcomed him into her home when he was young and poor. He remembered the way she'd held his hand at Helen's funeral, her voice cracking with grief. Eleanor, he said quietly, I don't think you're here to stop me. I think you're here because you're scared. And I think you're here because you know, deep down, that I'm doing the right thing. She stared at him. How can you say that Helen's children, your children, they need that money? They need it for their families, for their futures. They need it, Arthur repeated. They don't need me. They need my money. And I'm tired of being needed for what I have, instead of who I am. He stepped toward her, his voice softening. I loved your daughter. I loved her with everything I had. And I tried to raise our children to be good, kind people. But somewhere along the way, they lost their way. They lost sight of what matters. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Arthur, I'm not doing this to hurt them, he said. I'm doing it to save them, to give them a chance to remember who they used to be. He held out his hand. Will you let me show you what I mean? She looked at his hand, then at his face. Slowly, hesitantly, she took it. Arthur led her inside the bakery. He poured her tea. He sat her down at the table where Sarah had eaten her first cake. And he told her everything. About the trust. About his children's demands. About Sarah. About Harold Finch and the plan that was taking shape in his mind. When he was finished, Eleanor was silent for a long time. Then she looked at him, her expression shifting from grief to something else. Something that looked like hope. You've changed, she said. You're not the same man who stood at Helen's grave. I'm not, Arthur said. I'm the man I always should have been. The man Helen saw when she married me. The man who believed in building something, instead of just taking. Eleanor nodded slowly. Then I'll help you. I don't know how, but I'll help. For Helen. For the family. She looked at Sarah, who was standing quietly in the corner. And for her. She looks like she needs someone. Arthur smiled. She does. And so do I. The bakery was warm, filled with the scent of bread and the promise of new beginnings. Arthur looked at the two women in front of him, and he felt the weight of the world shift. He wasn't alone anymore. He had allies. He had a plan. And he had something his children had never expected. Hoped. The next 3 weeks became a blur of lawyers, documents, and late-night strategy sessions. Arthur had never imagined that his life would take this turn, that the quiet baker who rose before dawn would find himself in conference rooms with men in expensive suits, discussing legal maneuvers and fiduciary obligations. But he adapted, as he always had, with the same patience he applied to sourdough. He let the process rise. He waited for the right moment. Eleanor had become an unexpected ally. She'd been married to Helen's brother for 40 years before he passed, and she knew the family's history in ways Arthur had never fully understood. She knew about the old money, the old wounds, the old secrets that had festered across generations. And she knew exactly how to push back against the children who thought they could steamroll their father. Greg will try to file a motion for conservatorship, she said, spreading documents across the bakery's main table after hours. He'll argue that you're not of sound mind, that you're being manipulated, that the trust needs to be protected from your reckless decisions. She looked up at Arthur, her eyes sharp. We need to preempt that. We need to have a doctor evaluate you and certify that you're competent. We need to file our own motion, arguing that the trust is being protected, not exploited. Arthur nodded. He'd already thought of that. He'd contacted a geriatric specialist, a woman named Dr. Patricia Langley, who had a reputation for being fair and thorough. She'd spent 3 hours with him, asking questions, testing his memory, his decision-making, his understanding of complex financial concepts. Her report had been unequivocal. Arthur Webb was fully competent, with no signs of cognitive decline. He'd filed it with the court the same day he received it, but Greg didn't back down. None of them did. Jennifer was the strategist. She'd always been the one with the plan, the one who could anticipate every move. She'd hired a team of lawyers from Seattle, the kind who specialized in elder law and trust disputes. They filed motions, issued subpoenas, and demanded access to every document related to the trust. They tried to depose Harold Finch. They tried to subpoena Arthur's medical records. They even tried to have the bakery's property assessed, as if they were already planning to liquidate it. Evan was the financier. He'd flown in from San Francisco, his tech world confidence intact, and he'd set up a parallel operation. He hired forensic accountants to trace the trust's assets, arguing that there might be fraud or mismanagement. He made calls to Swiss banks and old law firms, trying to unearth any irregularities he could use to discredit Harold Finch and challenge the trust's validity, and Greg was the muscle. He'd moved into a hotel across the street from the bakery, and he'd taken to sitting in the coffee shop next door, watching the comings and goings. He'd approach customers on the street, asking questions about Sarah, about Arthur's habits, about anything he could use. He'd cornered Mrs. Harlow one morning and demanded to know if she'd seen any suspicious behavior. She'd told him to leave her alone, then come straight to Arthur to report the encounter. They're relentless, Eleanor said one evening. She was sitting at the table, her tea growing cold, her face lined with exhaustion. They're going to keep pushing until something breaks. Arthur looked at her, then at Sarah, who was perched on a stool behind the counter. The girl had been quiet throughout this entire process, watching and learning, absorbing everything like a sponge. She'd started reading the legal documents at night, underlining passages she didn't understand and asking Arthur to explain them in the morning. She was learning fast, faster than Arthur had expected. Something will break, Arthur said, but it's not going to be me. He glanced at the clock on the wall. I have a meeting with Harold tomorrow. He's found something that might give us leverage. Leverage, Eleanor's eyebrows rose. What kind of leverage? Arthur shook his head. He didn't say. He just said it was important, and that I should bring Sarah. The next morning, Arthur closed the bakery early. He hung a sign on the door, closed for family business. He didn't know if that was true anymore, if Greg, Jennifer, and Evan were still his family, in any meaningful sense. But the words felt right. Sarah was waiting in the back, her hair brushed, her clothes clean. She'd been staying with Eleanor for the past few nights, a precaution Arthur had insisted on after Greg's harassment had escalated. Eleanor had a small house on the other side of the neighborhood, with a garden and a spare room. It was safer there, away from the hotel windows and the prying eyes. They drove to Harold Finch's office in the city. It was a tall building, all glass and steel, the kind of place Arthur had always avoided. He'd never felt comfortable in spaces that smelled like corporate ambition. But he walked through the lobby with his head high, Sarah at his side, and took the elevator to the 27th floor. Harold's office was surprisingly warm. Wood paneling, leather chairs, a view of the river. He greeted them with a firm handshake and a cup of coffee that Arthur actually enjoyed. "Thank you for coming," Harold said. "I've uncovered something that I think will be useful." He pulled a thick folder from his desk and set it in front of them. This is a record of all the disbursements made from the trust over the past 3 decades. Not the principal, that's been untouched, but the interest income. It was supposed to be reinvested, per your mother's instructions. But a portion of it was diverted. Arthur leaned forward. Diverted to whom? Harold opened the folder and pointed to a series of entries. To a private account. One that was set up in the name of a holding company that your father controlled. The same holding company that made significant contributions to certain politicians and charities over the years. Things that, conveniently, benefited your father's business interests. Arthur's mind raced. His father, the man who had told him he was dead, who had cut him out of the estate, who had spent 30 years believing Arthur was gone. He'd been siphoning money from his own mother's trust. He knew, Arthur said. He knew about the trust. He knew it existed, and he still took the interest. Harold nodded. He did. And there's more. He turned to another section of the folder. The holding company wasn't just used by your father. Your children, Mr. Webb. They've been receiving payments from that company for years. Small ones at first, then larger ones. They didn't know the source. The company was set up to hide the trail. But they benefited from it. Arthur's blood went cold. He stared at the documents, at the names and numbers, at the pattern that emerged like a roadmap of betrayal. His children had been taking money from a trust they claimed to know nothing about, money that was rightfully his, money that had been stolen from his mother's legacy. He thought about Greg's mortgage, Jennifer's surgical practice, Evan's startup, all of it, built on a foundation of stolen wealth. Does this give us leverage? Sarah asked. Her voice was quiet, but steady. Harold smiled. It gives you everything. If you file this with the court, your children's credibility will be destroyed. They'll have to explain why they were receiving payments from a company that was improperly diverting trust funds. It doesn't matter that they didn't know the source. They still benefited. They still took the money. Arthur leaned back in his chair. He felt the weight of the folder in his hands, the weight of the evidence, the weight of 30 years of being underestimated. He could end this right now. He could file the documents and watch his children's case collapse. He could destroy their reputations, their careers, their carefully constructed lives. But he didn't want to destroy them. He wanted to teach them. How long do I have? He asked. Harold's eyebrows rose. How long until what? Until I file this. Until I bring it to court. Arthur's voice was calm, measured. I'm not going to use it to crush them. I'm going to use it to give them a choice. Sarah looked at him. What kind of choice? Arthur turned to her. The same choice they've been giving me. They've been demanding that I do what they want, that I give them what they need. Well, now it's my turn. They can have this. He tapped the folder. They can have it all, if they want. But they have to earn it. They have to come to me, admit what they've done, and ask for my forgiveness. Sarah's eyes widened. You think they'll do that? I don't know, Arthur admitted. But I'm going to give them the chance. He looked at Harold. I want you to set up a meeting. All 3 of them. At the bakery. I want to look them in the eyes when I tell them what I know. Harold studied him for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. I'll arrange it. But Arthur, be careful. These are desperate people. And desperate people do desperate things. Arthur stood up, tucking the folder under his arm. I know, but I've been careful my whole life. It's time to take a risk. The meeting was set for the following Saturday. Arthur spent the intervening days preparing, not with legal briefs or financial statements, but with something simpler. He baked. He made sourdough loaves, the same recipe he'd been using for 40 years. He made cinnamon rolls, the kind his children had loved when they were small. He made a chocolate cake, rich and dark, with the frosting his wife had taught him. He set the table in the back of the bakery, the same table where he'd shared meals with Helen, where he'd taught Sarah to knead dough. On Saturday morning, the bakery was spotless. The ovens were warm. The pastries were arranged in the display case. Arthur stood behind the counter, his apron clean, his hands steady. Greg arrived first. He came alone, his suit wrinkled, his eyes red-rimmed. He didn't say anything. He just sat down at the table, his hands clasped in front of him. Jennifer came next, with Martin. She was pale, her usual composure cracked at the edges. She sat across from Greg, her briefcase on the floor beside her, her hands trembling slightly. Evan was last. He walked in looking like he'd just gotten off a plane, rumpled, unshaven, his tie askew. He didn't look at anyone. He just took a seat at the end of the table. Arthur waited until they were all settled. Then he sat down at the head of the table, the folder from Harold Finch placed squarely in front of him. Thank you for coming, he said. I know this isn't easy for any of you, but we need to talk about the trust. We need to talk about what's been going on. Greg opened his mouth to speak, but Arthur held up a hand. Let me finish. I've been patient with you. I've given you everything I had. I've never asked for anything in return. But when I found out about the trust, when I found out that it had been mishandled, that you were taking money from it without even knowing, I was angry. I was hurt, and I needed time to decide what to do. He opened the folder and spread the documents across the table. This is what I found. Evidence that your grandfather diverted funds from the trust. Evidence that he set up a holding company. Evidence that you all benefited from those diverted funds, even if you didn't know where they came from. The room went silent. Jennifer's face went white. Greg stared at the papers like they were venomous. Evan looked like he was going to be sick. Dad, Jennifer whispered. We didn't know. I swear. We didn't know. I believe you, Arthur said. But that doesn't change the fact that you took the money, that you've been benefiting from stolen funds for years, and that you've been telling me I'm not competent to manage my own affairs while you were doing exactly that. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. I could file this. I could go to court. I could watch your lives unravel. But I don't want that. Greg's eyes met his. What do you want? Arthur leaned forward. I want you to admit what you've done. I want you to apologize, really apologize, and mean it. And I want you to agree to give up any claim you have on the trust. All of it. Greg stared at him. You're asking us to walk away from billions of dollars. I'm asking you to walk away from something that was never yours, Arthur said. And if you agree, I won't file this. I won't destroy your lives. I'll let you walk away with your reputations intact, and you'll never hear from me again. Jennifer's voice cracked. Dad, you can't be serious. You're our father. You're supposed to take care of us. Arthur looked at her, and for a moment, the sadness in his eyes was overwhelming. I've taken care of you for 40 years, he said. And what did I get in return? Distance. Disrespect. A phone call on my birthday, if I was lucky. You didn't want me to take care of you. You wanted me to give you my money. And now, when I'm finally standing up for myself, you're acting like I'm the one who's being cruel. Sarah stepped forward from the counter. He's not being cruel, she said. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the tension like a blade. He's being kind, kinder than you deserve. Greg looked at her, his face twisting with anger. Stay out of this. This is family. I am family, Sarah said. He's the only family I've ever had that actually cared, and I'll stand up for him, even if you won't. Arthur looked at her, a flicker of warmth in his eyes. Then he turned back to his children. The decision is yours. You have until the end of the day. If you agree, we can settle this without going to court. If you don't, he tapped the folder. I'll file this on Monday, and we'll see what the judge says. He stood up and walked to the back, leaving his children at the table, staring at the evidence of their own betrayal. Sarah followed him, her hand on his arm. Are you okay? She asked. That Arthur looked at her. I'm better than I've been in years, he said. I'm finally being honest. With them. With myself. He smiled. And it feels good. The silence in the bakery stretched on. Arthur poured himself a cup of coffee and waited. He didn't know what his children would decide. But he knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that he would be okay no matter what they chose. He had Sarah. He had his bakery. And he had the truth. That was more than enough. That the afternoon sun slanted through the streaked windows of Webb's Bread and Pastry, casting long rectangles of gold across the worn linoleum. Arthur stood at the counter, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He didn't drink it. He just held it, feeling the weight of the ceramic, the solidity of something familiar. His children had been at the table for 3 hours now. He could hear the low murmur of their voices, the occasional sharp word, the silences that stretched like rubber bands about to snap. He didn't eavesdrop. He didn't need to. He knew them well enough to imagine the shape of the argument. Greg pushing for a fight, Jennifer calculating the odds, Evan weighing the costs against the benefits. They were predators, all three of them, and they were trying to decide if the prey was worth the hunt. Sarah was beside him, her hands busy with a batch of dough. She'd taken to baking with a seriousness that surprised him. Her fingers moved with a rhythm that was still clumsy but earnest, pressing and folding, learning the language of flour and water. She didn't look at the table. She didn't need to. She trusted Arthur to handle his children, the way he'd trusted her to handle the morning rush. They're going to take the deal, Arthur said quietly. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to her or to himself. How do you know? Sarah asked, not looking up from her dough. because they're smart, and because they know that if they don't, I'll file those documents, and their reputations will be in ruins. He set down the coffee cup. They might not love me. They might not even respect me, but they respect the threat. Sarah paused. Do you want them to take the deal? Arthur considered the question. He thought about the years of silence, the gift cards, the phone calls that always felt like obligations. He thought about the funeral in the rain, the way his children had stood apart from him, strangers in their own mother's cemetery. He thought about the weight of the trust, the billions of dollars that had sat untouched for 30 years, waiting for someone who had never wanted it. I want them to learn something, he said. I want them to understand that there's more to life than money. That family isn't about what you can take. It's about what you can give. He looked at Sarah. That's what your mother taught me. That's what I tried to teach them, even if they never learned. Sarah didn't respond. She just kept kneading, her hands working the dough into a smooth, elastic ball. The table fell silent. Arthur looked over and saw Greg stand up, his face pale, his hands shaking. Jennifer was crying, her usual composure shattered. Evan was staring at the documents, his jaw tight, his eyes hollow. Greg walked over to Arthur. He stopped a few feet away, his shoulders hunched, his voice barely a whisper. We'll take the deal. We'll walk away. All of it. The trust, the claims, everything. He swallowed hard. We're sorry, Dad. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know we don't deserve your forgiveness. But we're sorry. Arthur looked at his son. He saw the boy he'd raised, the one who'd learned to ride a bike in the parking lot behind the bakery. He saw the years of distance, the walls they'd built around themselves. And he saw something else, too. Something that looked like regret. I forgive you, Arthur said. He didn't say it easily. The words came with effort, like pulling a heavy tray from the oven. But that doesn't mean I trust you. Trust has to be earned. And you have a long way to go. Greg nodded, his eyes wet. I know. I'll try. He stopped. Unable to finish that, Arthur reached out and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Go home, he said. Talk to your wife. Talk to your children. Be a father. That's all I ever wanted from you. Jennifer came over next. She was crying openly now, her carefully applied makeup streaked, her hands clutching a tissue that was already soaked. She threw her arms around Arthur, burying her face in his shoulder. I'm sorry, she sobbed. I'm so sorry. I was so afraid of losing you. And I thought if I could just control everything, I wouldn't have to feel it. Arthur held her. He felt the stiffness in her body, the tension that had been there for years, finally breaking. You never needed to control anything, he said. You just needed to be here. That's all. Just to be here. Evan was the last. He approached his father slowly, his face a mask of shame. I don't know what to say, he admitted. I spent so much time trying to prove I didn't need you, that I forgot. I forgot that I still wanted to. Arthur looked at his youngest son. He saw the boy who'd built a company from nothing, who'd made millions, who'd never once asked for advice because he was too proud. He saw the loneliness behind the success. Then stay, Arthur said. Stay for a while. Have dinner. Talk to your sister. Remember what it feels like to be a family. Evan nodded. He didn't say anything else. He just stood there, beside his father, and let the silence do its work. The sun was setting now, the bakery filled with the warm, amber light of early evening. Arthur looked at his children, at the mess they'd made and the healing that would take years. He didn't expect it to be easy. He didn't expect them to change overnight. But he was willing to try. He was willing to be patient. Sarah finished her dough and set it aside to rise. She came to stand beside Arthur, her small hand slipping into his. What happens now? She asked. Arthur looked at the bakery, at the flour-dusted counters, the display case filled with bread that would never taste as good as the bread his mother had made. He thought about the girl who'd come to him with nothing, who'd taken his milk and cake and asked for nothing in return. Now we bake, he said. We keep doing what we've always done. We make bread. We make pastries. We make a life. He squeezed her hand. And we wait. For what? For the dough to rise, Arthur said. That's all I've ever known how to do. Wait for the dough to rise. And it always does. It always rises, if you give it enough time. Sarah looked at him, her hollow eyes now full of something new. It wasn't hope exactly. It was something steadier. Something that looked like trust. Will they come back, she asked. Your children, will they be part of this? Arthur looked at Greg, who was talking quietly to Jennifer, their voices soft, their body language uncertain. He looked at Evan, who was staring at the bakery's faded sign, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he admitted. "That's up to them. They're going to have to make their own choices, their own mistakes, their own forgiveness." He turned to Sarah. "But you'll be here, and I'll be here, and that's enough for now." He walked to the front of the bakery and unlocked the door. The night air rushed in, cool and clean, carrying the scent of rain on asphalt. He stood in the doorway, looking out at the street, at the lamppost where Sarah had first sat, at the curb where she'd folded herself small. He thought about the first day she'd come to him, the way she'd looked at him with those hollow eyes, the way she'd eaten the cake like it was her last meal. He thought about the milk, the simple glass of milk he'd set in front of her, not knowing that it would change everything. "Arthur," Sarah's voice came from behind him. "What are you doing?" He turned to look at her. She was standing in the middle of the bakery, her hands dusted with flour, her face lit by the soft glow of the oven lights. She looked like she belonged there. She looked like she'd always belonged there. "I'm just remembering," he said. "The first time you came. The cake. The milk." He smiled. "You didn't ask for anything. You just took it." "I didn't know how to ask," Sarah said. "I didn't think I deserved anything." "That's what I thought too," Arthur said. "When I was young, when I walked away from my father, I thought I didn't deserve anything, that I had to build it all from scratch, or it didn't count." He walked back inside, closing the door behind him. The bell chimed softly, the same bell that had chimed when Sarah first walked through the door. "Let me show you something," he said. That he led her to the back of the bakery, to the safe that held his most important documents. He opened it and pulled out the envelope with his mother's letter. He unfolded it carefully, the paper soft with age, and handed it to Sarah. "This is what started it all," he said. "My mother's letter. The trust. The whole thing." Sarah read it slowly, her eyes moving across the lines of elegant script. When she finished, she looked up at him, her expression questioning. "Your mother wrote this," she said. "She wanted you to have everything." "She did. And I walked away. I was too proud, too angry." Arthur shook his head. "I wasted 30 years thinking I didn't need anyone, and all along, there was a legacy waiting for me." Sarah folded the letter and handed it back. "You've changed," she said. "You're not angry anymore." Arthur considered this. He thought about his children, about the meeting that had just ended. He thought about Harold Finch and the trust and the billions of dollars he still didn't want. He thought about his father, the man who'd told him he was dead, who'd siphoning money from a legacy that wasn't his. "No," he said. "I'm not angry. I'm tired. But I'm not angry." He looked at Sarah. "I've learned something. Something important." "What's that?" Arthur smiled. "That the things that matter most can't be given. They have to be earned. Milk and cake, bread and pastries, trust and love. You can't just hand them over. You have to show people that you're worthy of them." He walked to the counter and pulled out a fresh batch of dough. He placed it on the wooden surface, dusted it with flour, and began to knead. "Are you going to tell your children?" Sarah asked. "About the letter about your mother?" Arthur shook his head. "Not yet. They're not ready. And maybe they'll never be ready." He looked at her. "But you're ready. You've been ready since the first time you walked through that door." Sarah looked at him, her eyes bright. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that this." He gestured to the bakery, to the flour in the ovens and the dough beneath his hands. "This is yours too, if you want it. It's not a gift. It's an invitation. You can stay. You can learn. You can make it your own." Sarah's face broke into a smile, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It changed her, made her look younger, lighter, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that a lot." Arthur nodded and returned to his kneading. The dough was soft and pliable, yielding to his hands the way it always had. He thought about his mother, about the trust, about the billions of dollars that would now be used for something good. He thought about his children, who had finally seen the truth, even if it had taken them years to understand. He thought about Sarah, the girl who'd come to him with nothing, who'd taken his milk and cake and asked for nothing in return. She was the one who'd taught him what mattered. Not the money, not the legacy, not the revenge. The simple act of giving, without expectation, without condition. That the sun was gone now, the bakery dark except for the glow of the oven. Arthur finished his kneading and set the dough aside to rise. He turned to Sarah and placed his flour-dusted hand on her shoulder. "Tomorrow," he said, "we start again. We open the bakery. We sell bread. We make a life." He smiled. "And we remember that the best things in life are the ones you don't expect." The ones that show up on your doorstep, looking for milk and cake. Sarah nodded. She was crying now, but she was smiling too, the tears streaming down her flour-dusted cheeks. What are we going to name the bakery? She asked as Arthur looked at the sign, the faded gold letters that had been there for as long as he could remember. He thought about his mother's legacy, his father's betrayal, his children's redemption. He thought about the girl who'd changed everything. We're going to keep the name, he said. Webb's Bread and Pastry. Because that's who we are. That's who we've always been. He looked at her. But we're going to make it something new. Something better. Something that's ours. He turned off the oven and locked the door. The bakery was quiet, the silence filled with the scent of rising dough and the promise of tomorrow. Arthur Webb, at the age of 72, had finally found what he'd been looking for all along, that he had found his family.